filosofia e psicanálise. Queria, então, bom dia a todos novamente, agora gravando. Queria, em nome do grupo de pesquisa, subjetividade, filosofia e psicanálise, acolher a todos. Queria agradecer muitíssimo a participação nessa mesa da Paula Entrudo, também trabalha conosco aqui no grupo, e do nosso colega, já bastante presente entre nós, o Vinícius, que vão, então, apresentar seus trabalhos. Para conduzir os trabalhos, eu gostaria de passar a palavra ao Vitor Costa, que vai nos orientar quanto aos procedimentos da mesa. Juste une salutation, Vinicius, à tout le monde, un mot de remerciement à toi pour ta présence et ta apresentação. Voilà. Vitor Costa, bem-vindo. Te passo a palavra. Vamos ver se o Vitor consegue nos... Vitor?
Agora sim,
Ah,
conseguem me ouvir?
agora, multiverso. Em multiverso, ok.
Dá para me
Agora
ouvir?
sim.
Conduzo agora então em inglês, certo? Certo? Me ouve?
Vitor, para mim está falhando um pouco. Fala mais um pouco aí para ver se melhora. Acho que talvez é uma questão de conexão.
Dá para me ouvir agora? Conseguem me ouvir?
Agora sim, pode seguir, por favor.
Certo. Agora eu passo para o inglês, certo, Wayne?
Perfeito, como vocês combinaram.
Certo. Muito bem. I am very honored for this invitation to be here with you in one more great moment with our so strong group of study. My name is Vitor Costa. Thank you, Professor Wayne, for my presentation. But I'm here just to present to the two stars of our morning, Paula Entrudo and Vinicio Busacchi. I will present our friends. Paula Mariana Entrudo holds a bachelor's and master's degree in philosophy from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. Currently, she's a doctoral candidate in philosophy at the Federal University of Ceará with a CAPS scholarship and will undertake a research period at the Università degli Studi di Cagliari in Italy. In collaboration with Vinicio Busacchi, her doctoral research focuses on the implications of Jürgen Habermas' work, Knowledge and Human Interests, particularly its reception by theorists of the so-called fourth generation of critical theory. In this context, she seeks to explore the connections between critical theory and psychoanalytic theory, addressing the central question: why does critical theory need psychoanalysis? Paula Entrudo is also a member of several research groups, including the Subjectivity, Philosophy and Psychoanalysis Research Group in the Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul, the Philpsych International Network, and the Philosophy and Psychoanalysis Working Group of UNPOF. The title of her presentation will be Emancipation Through Communication, Habermas and the Project of Modernity. Vinicio Busacchi is a field professor of theoretical philosophy in the Università degli Studi di Cagliari, Italy, where he is a member of the doctoral committee of the Department of Pedagogy, Psychology, and Philosophy. He is a member of the Laboratório de Psicoanálise, Hermenêutica e Fenomenologia, participates in the postgraduate program in philosophy at the Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul, and acts as a representative of the Fond Ricoeur from Paris in Italy. Vinicio Busacchi is also president of the Academy of Human and Social Sciences in Rome, and co-founder and co-director of the journal Critical Hermeneutics, biannual international journal of philosophy. His main research areas include the history and theory of psychoanalysis, the philosophy of Paul Ricoeur, and the philosophy of Jürgen Habermas. He is the author of 24 books and more than 200 scientific articles. Among his published works are Hermenêutica del Profundo, Jürgen Habermas, interprete di Freud, Pulsione e significato, la psicoanalisi di Freud nella filosofia di Paul Ricoeur, Ricoeur versus Freud, and Habermas and Ricoeur, Depth Hermeneutics, from psychoanalysis to a critical human science. The title of his presentation will be What is Emancipation? Habermas under discussion. Well, Paula, Vinicio, it's great to me to be here with you. And if I'm right, Vinicio starts. The word is with you. Or that's right.
Thank you very much, Victor. Good morning to everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you again this year. Thank you to Wayne, all of you. I'm really happy even to understand that this series of international conferences are becoming a kind of tradition in Brazil and everywhere in the world. And this is very important by the many ways. I mean, in the sense that nowadays, even philosophy is in search of interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary dialogue, as well as philosophy, as well as psychoanalysis more and more is in need of rethinking in theoretical terms these his key elements in these speculative consequences, if you want. And I would say that I'm really happy to discuss with you in within this round table, this kind of theme. Perhaps I can share some slides because I'm really happy because the thematic of emancipation is a complex theme nowadays in philosophy, but even in psychoanalysis, because there are many different perspectives, and the position of Habermas is highly critical for many reasons. I can start perhaps by probably I need to have some authorization for the responsible of the platform to share my slides. If you can, okay.
Pessoal, tem que colocar ele. Ok.
Okay. Perhaps, yeah. This way I can see that I can understand that I'm sharing my slides. So first of all, I was saying that it's important to discuss, even in a critical way, this discourse concerning emancipation from philosophical perspective, from psychoanalytical perspective, but even considering the fact that this concept of emancipation is highly, how to say, conflictual in terms of rethinking somehow in a critical way Habermas's view on psychoanalysis and the consequences that can have to reconsider Habermas' rereading of psychoanalysis for today's interest of research. And then, first of all, I would say these. Probably you know many things that I am going to introduce, but can be useful to remind some of those general elements. First of all, emancipation is not a philosophical concept. I mean, the history of emancipation has much more to do with the legal dimension and political dimension instead of philosophical. Since the ancient time, this concept of emancipation has been doing with something concerning freedom but something concerning the emancipation of person in terms of legal recognition in this sense, legal in the sense even of political, social recognition. Only recently, recently in the last decades, thanks to two philosophers, Jürgen Habermas and Paul Ricoeur, we had this important advancement of the theme of emancipation, the concept of emancipation within the philosophical debates. Obviously now there are many philosophers that are working on this concept from different perspectives, political theory, philosophical theory in terms of theoretical research, philosophy of psychoanalysis, and so on, social critical theory, and so on. Anyway, Ricoeur and Habermas are those who at first started by using this idea of emancipation by proposing a kind of context in terms of speculative conception for this use, for this understanding of emancipation in philosophical terms, with direct strong consequences even for our discourse, the discourse concerning our interest in psychoanalysis. There is a difference because if you want, Ricoeur has the tendency to interpret this concept as an existential and moral concept. Conversely, Habermas, as you know, essentially links it to the experience of liberation from ideological constraints and to freedom, social constraints in terms of limitation, the capacity to act, to understand, to interact with others. But as I said, both of them have this common interest for the psychological dimension. That means in which way we can re-respect, re-understand, reconsider emancipation in terms of a key concept for inner advancement, inner progress, inner emancipation of the human being. So huge differences, but even a certain element of commonality, if you want. It is for this reason that perhaps I can start by saying something in terms of in general perspective around Ricoeur, because by contrast, we can even better appreciate, in my view, the specificity and the originality of Habermas' view, which is the major focus for our discussion today. And in this way, perhaps we can grasp some additional elements beyond the specific point of a critical sociological understanding of this concept in relation to Habermas' theory towards a general understanding of the human being. Why this? Because actually Ricoeur's perspective on emancipation has mostly to do with the human being. We can say that the philosophy of the human being of Ricoeur has to do with this idea that we are born as individuals, but to become a person is a kind of process, that must be understood by the many ways, because it's a biological process, a psychological process, a cultural process, a spiritual process. But the key point of this view is the fact that the change is an aspect of life and an aspect of human identity. And actually, his more mature view of the human being, or philosophy of the human being, is centered on this idea of the capable human being, or in Latin, homo capax, in which this capability has to do with this kind of processuality or ability to express in an emancipatory way the personal reality, the personal identity. We are born as individuals, but to become a person is a process. It's a cultural, social process, it's a moral process, it's a process, as I said before, of emancipation. And the key point is change. He has this idea that the change is an aspect of identity, as he says, that has a dramatic aspect on a human level, that of a personal history entangled with the countless stories of our companions in existence, and so on. This is a key element of his view to understand, properly understand that Ricoeur's view on emancipation is really connected, strongly connected with this idea of change within the human being, and this idea that emancipation has mostly to do with this kind of evolution, if you want, evolution in terms of personal experience throughout the happenings at the level of daily life. It is for this reason, for the fact that Ricoeur's connected in a so strong way the concept of emancipation with this personal dimension, that psychoanalysis plays a very, very important role in Ricoeur's view. As you know, probably the majority of you knows, his book Freud and Philosophy is centered in this two level of analysis of psychoanalysis. First of all, is a kind of reading of Freud, and the second part is a kind of dialectic of psychoanalysis, or philosophical or speculative reinterpretation of Freud. And in this second part, he developed this idea of emancipation in terms of processuality, putting at the center this difference between the tendency of a spirit in the sense of an inner life, full of practical inspiration, moral interest, and so on, towards future, and the tendency of the unconscious life, of the psychic life, that is addressed to the past, that is connected to the past. Actually, those who are affected by neurosis in Ricoeur's understanding are much more conditioned by the unconscious function instead of the spirit. But all of us, stay on this view, has this kind of experience at the daily life, at the base of a daily life, this kind of dialectics between regressive tendencies and progressive tendencies, or this dialectics between arche and telos. So the unconscious is the key elements of this regressive tendency that human beings can experience, and the spirit is the aspiration for progression. But anyway, it is even true that the more mature Ricoeur developed his discourse on emancipation, connecting it to this dimension of existential reality. In fact, he's used to speak of, in his final book, Course of Recognition, speak around this idea that the emancipation has to do with the dialectic of recognition. It's not simply to recognize the value of our past experiences and the values of our interactions in the daily life, but the centrality of the importance of the fighting for recognition in a social context. And then you have here this idea that emancipation has a kind of vertical elements and a kind of horizontal level. Emancipation in terms of vertical elements in Ricoeur is this dialectic between regressive tendencies and progressive tendencies, and the horizontal is this dialectics which is the fighting for recognition, or the asking for recognition that we can find in our social context. As you can see, anyway, even the more mature Ricoeur, they connected to this vision in terms of emancipation view, in terms of a psychological aspect of human life, or if you want to readdress this understanding in a philosophical way, the idea that emancipation has to do with a progressive tendency of emancipation of the human being, which is rooted in the inner life, in the personal life. Now, the vision of Habermas is totally different compared to this vision, but we have to understand in which way Habermas is able to introduce the element of psychoanalysis, and why decided to take the direction of something really distant from a psychological or existential perspective of emancipation. In which way we have to understand his view, and the quality or novelty, if you want, of this idea of emancipation. That is the first question. The second is, which is this role that plays psychoanalysis in his understanding of emancipation, in his interpretation of human condition, the human condition. Well, first of all, we know that Habermas is linked to the Frankfurtian tradition, but immediately he started in a critical way to address Karl Marx's view and above all historical materialism. Even if is directly connected to this tradition, for example, is actually recognized that there is no distinction between theory and practice. Theory and praxis. Those two different dimensions means that Habermas was aware that Marx, as well as the philosopher of Frankfurt School, properly had a properly correct understanding of this deep link between knowledge and practical consequences of knowledge. Or, as he said later in the 60s, knowledge and the human interest. But anyway, he was directly and strongly critical towards Marx and this historical materialism. According to Habermas, the expansion of the productive forces cannot explain the development of intersubjective capacities. With his focus on production, Marx missed the potential for emancipation in the sphere of interaction. He confused mastery of external nature with human freedom and neglected social repression of internal nature. So we find this contradiction. That means that Habermas is not diametrically opposed to Ricoeur's view, recognizing that there is something that has to do with emancipation, deeply connected with the inner life, the psychological or psychic life. But at the same time, because of his connection with Frankfurtian School, he recognized that even the neo-Marxist approach was right. In fact, his criticism against Marx does not mean that Habermas follows the path of an individualistic exaltation of emancipation. In addition, the discourse of emancipation is linked to the discourse of a critique of ideology, which has an emancipatory value both at the individual level as well as the social level. And this is the point, the key point, the key starting point to underline the novelty of the problematization of emancipation in Habermas. The fact that emancipation has to do not to the liberation of conflicts related to the past or personal neurotic experiences or personal familiar experience. It has to do with the freedom, with the challenging for freedom in connection to the dynamics of oppression in our society. The dynamics that they use to condition the human beings, as is happening even today, obviously. And for this reason, the correct perspective to understand consequences of Habermas understanding, Habermas reading of emancipation must requires this approach of social critique, of a kind of social critique. As you know, the basic work of Habermas is this theory of communicative action, which is entirely centered on a theory of action, or rather, on the one hand, on the dialectic between instrumental action and communicative action, and on the other hand, between the life world and the system. Now we can say that the life world, the world of life, the world of human existence, is essentially connected to the concept of communicative action, where its counterpart, that's the system, bind essentially to the concept of instrumental action. Now, the crucial focus of the Habermasian diagnosis contemporary society regards exactly the massive and growing interference of the system in the life world. The more the society is becoming rational, the more the society is becoming bureaucratic, the more the society is becoming instrumental, the less people are free, the less people are able to live free and emancipatory experiences. And then it is this that can explain the augmentation of, in terms of frustration, inauthenticity, and sufferings of human beings of today. Why this? Because a progressively rationalized life world is made dependent upon increasingly complex, formally organized domains of action, like economy and the state and administration, and creating this kind of consequences. What is the uniqueness of Habermas' view on emancipation? It is expressed in this book, Habermas' work on Erkenntnis und Interesse, knowledge and human interests, starting from the distinction between communicative action and instrumental action. Now, I probably have no time to illustrate all points, but I'm much more interested in but perhaps during the discussion we can come back to this point. Much more interested in focusing the key points of this view, and the key point to understand the originality of Habermas' interpretation of the idea of emancipation. The key point is the idea of self-reflection. Self-reflection is the key concept of emancipation. In fact, in self-reflection, as Habermas says, I quote, knowledge for the sake of knowledge comes to coincide with interest in autonomy and responsibility. Perhaps you can immediately grasp a kind of a connection with how to say, with a Kantian view. We can read perhaps this passage that it's more clear in this sense. Self-reflection is at once intuition and emancipation, comprehension and liberation from dogmatic dependence. The dogmatism that reason undoes both analytically and practically is false consciousness, error, and unfree existence in particular. Only the ego that apprehends itself in intellectual intuition as the self-positioned subject obtains autonomy. The dogmatist, on the contrary, because he cannot summon up the force to carry out self-reflection, lives in this person as a dependent subject that is not only determined by object, but is itself made into a thing. He leads an unfree existence because it does not become unconscious of his self-reflection, self-activity. Dogmatism is equally a moral lack and a theoretical incapacity. So as you can see, the key concept is this of self-reflection. I consider this idea important even in comparison with Ricoeur, because Ricoeur is not clear in defining why and in which way these dialectics between regressive forces and progressive forces, or these elements that change is a key natural aspect of the human being, can in itself justify a progressive approach to life. in which way it can be a guarantee for the achievement of a kind of emancipation. Conversely, in Habermas, we have this idea that self-reflection is the key. And Habermas finds exactly in psychoanalysis this kind of knowledge, which is not how to say, it doesn't work following an instrumental interest. Psychoanalysis is an example of knowledge which is oriented towards emancipation, as well as critical theory, as well as this social critique or this reflexive philosophy. And then it can be used as a kind of example of an emancipation properly, directly conducted in order to achieve emancipation towards the other. As you know, to offer a full understanding of readdressing in terms of hermeneutics, this idea of psychoanalysis as a kind of emancipatory practice, Habermas used Lorenz's theory. And this use of Lorenz's theory, which is well known, and perhaps we can discuss during our round table, is highly challenged. There are many interpreters that doesn't accept this idea to reread Freud's psychoanalysis in terms of hermeneutics. And there are many problems. Even me in my studies, I underline many defects in Habermas' rereading of Freud under this perspective, rereading Freud, rereading psychoanalysis as a kind of depth hermeneutics, as a kind of hermeneutics interpretation exercised or research of meaning, of the meaning exercise at the psychical level. But beyond this point, the key elements in my understanding is this one, represented by this key passage of knowledge and human interest, which offers even a key elements for the understanding of Habermas' perspective on psychoanalysis. Says the analyst instructs the patient in reading his own text, which he himself has mutilated and distorted, and translated symbols from mode of expression deformed as a private language into the mode of expression of public communication. This translation reveals the genetically important phase of life history to a memory was previously blocked, and brings to a consciousness the person's own self-formative process. Thus, psychoanalytic hermeneutics, unlike the cultural sciences, aims not at the understanding of symbolic structure in general, rather the act of understanding to which it leads is self-reflection. Repressions can be eliminated only by virtual reflection. For me, this is a key passage of a tremendous importance, because it's saying that it's not the knowledge of the analyst, it's not his technique, it's not psychoanalysis in itself that can promote personal human advancement, but this key point, this double key point. First, if the analyst is moved by a true interest for the emancipation of patient, if there is something at this level, if the analyst is acting not simply as a technician, as a psychologist, as an expert of this discipline, but someone who has the active, effective, if you want, more social interest for human emancipation, for the emancipation of the patient. And secondly, if within this process, the analyst is able to activate this self-reflective movement. If the patient is not only passively accepting the interpretation of the analyst, passively participating to the meeting, to the therapeutic appointment, but if he He's opening a new way, a new course in reconsidering his own past, in reconsidering his own future, and at the same time, he's in reconsidering his home place in our society, because there is this double level. Again, and this is my last reflection, my last consideration, even in Habermas, from a different perspective, again, we have this crossing between a vertical idea of emancipation and a horizontal idea of emancipation. But if in recur, the central point is this vertical focus, in Habermas, it seems to me that there is more balanced the two elements. There is the social need for interaction in order to promote emancipation. That means without the others, there is no way for personal emancipation in a very productive way, in a very large way. And at the same time, actually, even Habermas recognizes the importance to be in direct connection, that the person should be in direct connection with his own inner life. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinicio. Thank you very much. Now, I will pass the word to Paula. Paula, it's all up to you now. It's a pleasure to be with you here today.
Thank you very much, Victor. Yeah, it is a huge pleasure for me being here and participate in this conference today and to share, even briefly, some key points from the research I've been developing. In this presentation, I intend to discuss the theme Emancipation Through Communication, Habermas and the Project of Modernity, through the work Knowledge and Human Interests, in which Habermas proposes a new understanding of emancipation based on self-reflection, mediated by language. Starting then from Habermas' idea that all knowledge is guided by interests, I will highlight the emancipatory interest and the exemplary role of psychoanalysis as a model of communicative self-reflection. In doing so, I intend to show how, already in Knowledge and Human Interests, Habermas lays, if we can say, the groundwork for a conception of emancipation that takes place through the removal of barriers to communication, both internal and social, anticipating his later notion of communicative reason and offering an alternative to the crisis of the modern project diagnosed by the first generation of the Frankfurt School. So the Frankfurt School, especially Adorno and Horkheimer, agreed that the integration of individuals into capitalist society through the culture industry and instrumental reason led critical theory to adopt a more skeptical stance toward the revolutionary praxis. So in dialectic of alignment, they show that reason, as an instrument of emancipation, had become means of domination, making impossible somehow the radical social transformation conceived by classical Marxism. Faced with this situation, a crisis emerged, I would say. If revolution seemed unachievable, what would be the role of critical theory? Should it merely offer social diagnosis, or could it still promote emancipation? And I would say that it is in this context that Habermas intervenes, seeking to renew the critical project. So he agrees that in advanced capitalism, domination is maintained not only through repression or the influence of the culture industry, but also through the systematic distortion of communication, which prevents rational understanding between individuals. So emancipation is not achieved simply by rejecting authority or freeing desires, but through reflective processes in which individuals recognize the internal and ideological constraints that distort their self-understanding. For Habermas, subjectivity is formed through communicative process of self-reflection rather than being merely the result of repression or even the internalization of authority. While Adorno and Horkheimer in this work, Dialectic of Alignment, diagnosed the failure of the modern project and the transformation of reason into a kind of tool of domination, Habermas refuses to abandon the alignment ideal and instead seeks to reconstruct it normatively. Rather than rejecting reason, he aims to free it from instrumental form and recover its emancipatory potential through a communicative and intersubjective conception. So in knowledge and human interests, this reconstruction begins with the formulation of the emancipatory interest rooted in self-reflection mediated by language, which reveals a still valid normative core of modernity, that is the possibility of emancipation through rational critique and dialogue. So in this context, psychoanalysis is reinterpreted in knowledge and human interests as a model of reflexive and emancipatory science aimed at overcoming the distortions in the subject's self-understanding, showing that emancipation takes place through communication and language. In this reinterpretation, Habermas approached psychoanalysis through a hermeneutic lens, understanding the analytic process as a form of interpretation aimed not simply at explaining causal mechanisms, but at reconstructing meaning through dialogue. This hermeneutic dimension reinforces his view that emancipation depends on communicative understanding rather than technical control. It is also worth noting that knowledge in human interests marks a decisive point in the second generation of critical theory, as it is in this work that three new concepts emerge in the Habermasian project. The first one, I would say, that is the introduction of the communicative dimension. A major development, for example, in relation to theory and practice, is the introduction of the communicative dimension as the basis of critical rationality. Rather than focusing only on the link between theory and revolution, what Habermas finds in knowledge and human interests, what Habermas finds exemplary in psychoanalysis, is the communicative structure of the therapeutic process. For him, analysis is an asymmetrical yet irrational dialogue in which the analyst helps the patient remove barriers to communication. And these barriers to communication are both psychic and linguistic. So the unconscious, for Habermas, if you can say, can be understood as a kind of a distortion in the capacity of linguistic self-reflection, that is, as internal communicative blockades that can be accessed and transformed through the discursive work of analysis. The second concept is the overcoming of the philosophy of consciousness. So Habermas agrees that much of the modern philosophical tradition, especially Cartesian rationalism and positivism, conceives the knowing subject in a monological way, reducing the world to an object to be manipulated and knowledge to a mere instrument. By contrast, Habermas proposes understanding knowledge in terms of the interests that guide it, showing that every cognitive act is rooted in a reflexive relationship between the self and the world. In this way, Habermas shifts the focus of traditional epistemology toward the analysis of fundamental cognitive interests, and maintains that emancipation arises from self-reflection, which allows the subject to be freed from unconscious and ideological constraints. And the third concept is the three interests of knowledge. So here, Habermas proposes that human knowledge is guided by three fundamental interests. The first is the technical interest, in which we can find empirical analytic sciences aimed at controlling and manipulating nature. It is based on instrumental reason and positivist logic. The second interest, it is practical, in which we can find historical hermeneutic sciences concerned with understanding and interpreting the social world, grounded in dialogue and the reconstruction of meaning. And the third one is the emancipatory interest, in which we can find critical social sciences like critical theory and psychoanalysis. And this refers to the individual's ability to reflect critically on the conditions that limit their autonomy, whether ideological or unconscious. In psychoanalysis, this interest appears in the reflexive reconstruction of subjectivity, allowing the individual to understand the unconscious determinations that shape their actions. Habermas sees in this model an example of a science directed toward self-reflection and emancipation, a foundation of critical theory itself, which seeks to clarify the conditions that sustain domination and prevent rational self-understanding. Thus, Habermas understands Freudian psychoanalysis as a science that best illustrates knowledge guided by emancipation. While empirical sciences are concerned with predict or even control behavior, psychoanalysis focuses on freeing the subject from unconscious constraints that distort self-understanding. These three interests converge in Habermas' reading of psychoanalysis into, I would say, the most complete model of a science guided by emancipation here in knowledge and human interests. Psychoanalysis for Habermas exemplifies a form of knowledge that integrates an emancipatory interest into its method by bringing to light the sources of distortion in inner communication, like drives, impressions, and symptoms. It enables the subject to free from the compulsions that constrain them through the act of articulation. So the analytic process is a form of self-knowledge mediated through language. Analytic speech is performative. By narrating and articulating repressed content, the subject reconstructs their experience and opens up the possibility of emancipation through a communicative process of self-reflection, a kind of a communication with oneself, mediated by the other, by the analyst. An emancipation for Habermas, here in Knowledge and Human Interests, takes place when, through language and self-reflection, the individual removes somehow the barriers that distort communication with themselves and with others. considering that knowledge and human interests is regarded as one of the most significant works in this intersection of critical theory and psychoanalysis, this work has been emphatically revisited in recent debates, both in attempts to recover the critical insights it offers and also to challenge it as a source of a kind of missteps in the historically productive dialogue between these two disciplinary fields. One example is Amy Allen's book, Critique on the Cult. One example of this trying to recover these critical insights is this book, Amy Allen's book, Critique on the Couch, in which she argues that Habermas, by interpreting Freud in terms of linguistically mediated self-reflection, ends up domesticating the critical potential of psychoanalysis, reducing it to an instrument of communicative rationality and neglecting its affective and non-rational dimensions. She agrees that by focusing on the intelligibility of symbolic content and on the restoration of distorted communicative relations, Habermas seeks, and this is in Allen's view, to fit psychoanalysis into a kind of rationalist framework that privileges the motivational power of rational insight over the fragmented and affective dimensions of subjective experience. In doing so, Allen argues that Habermas sidelines what Allen calls the affective dimension rooted in the blockades to subjective experience, as well as its importance in releasing creative potentials for both individual self-understanding and social transformation. For Allen, this rationalist interpretation is problematic because, drawing on Klein, she argues that emancipation in psychoanalysis involves more than an analytical knowledge. It requires a process through which the analysand can experience and integrate the unconscious as it emerges, incorporating it into practical understanding. Here, we could respond to Allen's objection, and of course, in a briefly way because of the time, by returning to the epistemological core of knowledge and human interests. It is important to note that Habermas does not aim to psychoanalysis by reducing it to a form of fully transparent communicative rationality, but rather to situate it within the horizon of the emancipatory interest. That is as a kind of knowledge oriented towards self-reflection mediated by language. In his interpretation, analysis is not merely concerned with the rational intelligibility of symbolic content, but with the discursive reconstruction of the blockades that limit the subject's self-understanding. Thus, the rational insight is not purely cognitive. Is not a purely cognitive exercise, but it is a reflexive process through which the individual recognizes, by means of language, the unconscious determinations that condition them. By conceiving the unconscious as a form of communicative distortion, Habermas neither eliminates it nor translates it entirely into reason, but I would say that he reinscribes it within the field of experience that can be transformed through interpretation. Emancipation in the Habermas of knowledge and human interests, therefore, does not consist in dissolving affective or instinctual conflict, but in making it an object of communicative reflection, a movement in which the affective and symbolic dimensions of experience are articulated without one annulling another. If Alan, inspired by Adorno and even Butler, understands that emancipation requires recognizing what resists to rational integration, like affects, traumas, the body itself, and the historicity of domination, and proposes a negative critique of the reason that does not seek to reconcile everything through language, but rather to preserve conflict and opacity as conditions for critical thought. Habermas, on the other hand, maintains, I would say, that the unconscious is neither denied nor dissolved within reason. He understands the unconscious as a field of communicative distortions that calls for reflexive interpretation. Analysis thus becomes the space in which the subject confronts the mediations that block self-understanding, precisely those effects, traumas, the body, and the historicity of domination. And it is in this confrontation, rather than in the elimination of conflict, that the emancipatory process takes place in Habermas. So, if Alan argues that emancipation in psychoanalysis requires a process in which the analysand experiences and integrates the unconscious as it emerges into practical understanding, I would respond that this is precisely what Habermas aims somehow to access by removing the linguistic blockades that distort self-understanding. Analysis makes the unconscious communicatively available, and it is in this very moment of verbalization that its emancipatory force appears. To conclude, it is important to note that although Habermas' theory has faced criticism, such as the ones raised by Alan, and certain aspects remains the subject of intense debate, knowledge and human interests continues to be work of renewed relevance for contemporary critical theory, given the questions it raises and the way it reveals both the richness, I would say, and also the open-ended nature of the connection between psychoanalysis, emancipation, communication, and self-reflection. Of course, exploring in depth the different attempts to reinterpret this work in current debates, or even the dialogue between Alan and Habermas itself, which is the focus of my PhD research, would go beyond the time limits of this presentation. But my aim here has been to offer a kind of introductory understanding of how Habermas brings together key concepts such as emancipation, language, and the foundations of psychoanalysis in knowledge and human interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula. Congratulations to you, to Vinicio. Now we have almost half hour to make a debate. If someone have questions, that's the time. Obviously, I have some things to say. I don't know if I should use my powers here and say in front of everybody, but I will do. And I will be say just some words. Paula, I'm thinking it's almost 4 years since I heard you for the first time, and I could say everything I know about Habermas is against my will, but thank you for everything in these last years. And today I have a moment of insight. I was searching for the concept of communication, and for a long time, and I forgot Habermas. The of Habermas, and I think today something will change my research. I hope I could keep this promise to you. And I want to ask you, you have shown with great precision how Habermas reinscribes Freud's psychoanalysis within the horizon of community and emancipatory self-reflection, transforming the unconscious into a form of communicative distortion, if I'm right. I don't know if I understand what you said, but based on this hypothesis, I would ask you, how do you see the possibility or the limit of a reconciliation between Habermasian confidence in language and irreducibly opaque dimension of the unconscious that authors like Amy Allen defend? In other words, would it be possible to conceive of a communicative emancipation that preserves the tragic, the untranslatable within language itself? Sorry, I said very much. I promised the contrary. And thank you again.
Thank you very much, Victor, for your question. I'd say that that's a very rich and important question. I would say that the key point here is to avoid reading Habermas' trust in language as a form of naive transparency. When he speaks of communication and self-reflection, he doesn't mean that everything can be completely articulated or rationally mastered. What he proposes in Knowledge and Human Interests is that emancipation depends on making those inner blockades objects of reflection through communication, including the ones we could call tragic or opaque. In this sense, the unconscious for Habermas is not erased, but I'd say is reinscribed within the field of experience that can be interpreted. It remains a source of conflict and negativity, but one that can enter the space of dialogue, even if never fully dissolved there. So communicative emancipation does not mean eliminating opacity, I would say, but it means learning to relate to it through discourse, to give form through language to what resists being fully translated. So in this framework, the drives, for example, is not excluded, but reinterpreted. So Habermas does not eliminate the Freudian idea of the drive as an unconscious force but I would say that he shifts it from the metapsychological level to the communicative one. So the drives becomes a form of internal coercion and kind of obstacle to the subject's communication with themselves and with others. For this reason, psychoanalytic analysis, according to Habermas, is a model of emancipatory knowledge, because through language, the subject can become aware of these internal blockades and transform them into objects of reflection. And I would say that a possible reconciliation with Amy Allen would be if we understand Habermas not as reducing the unconscious to reason, but as proposing a model in which the tension between the rational and the non-rational becomes precisely the motor of self-reflection. So emancipation is not a total reconciliation, but a kind of process that keeps this conflict alive within communication itself. Yeah, I would say this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula. I hope you won. We have 20 minutes. Someone?
I have a question. Thank you very much. For Freud, the knowledge we can have of the unconscious is limited because there is a part of the unconscious that always remain unconscious, and this part of the unconscious always influences our actions. So it seems that a total emancipation is not possible for Freud. I would like to know how Habermas sees the limits of the emancipation. To what extent achieving a total emancipation is possible?
I don't know
I think
if the question is up to Paula, perhaps, or
It's for you, Vinicio.
for me. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's is an important point. I would say that there is no interest in Habermas for a total emancipation. There is no interest in this sense. And if you want, there is no possibility to achieve this kind of total emancipation in terms of full freedom, full expression of human inner creativity, in the sense that you can find somehow, if you want, theoretically speaking, in a Freudian perspective. Why? Because for Habermas, first of all, we are social beings. That means that the search for personal freedom has to do, and then the search for personal emancipation is connected to this value of search of emancipation of others. And then because of this deep intertwining of our social life, the challenging point is if we are able to progress as social beings in a way that society in itself can become an emancipatory reality. What is happening now is saying that the system is colonizing the world life. No, we are becoming more and more dependent from techno-scientific things, more and more involved in this false idea of be free, or be able to express ourselves through techniques, be more free in terms of capability to move and so on. But conversely, we are much more bound because there is no interest for the freedom of personal creativity and so on. And then for this reason, actually, Habermas finds in Freud this extraordinary important example of a knowledge that mirrors a concrete interest for emancipation. That is actually the key point. If you want, there is even a kind of limitation in this rereading in terms of hermeneutics, because by considering that psychoanalytical process is mostly at the level of this exchange of language and communication, of this attempt to dissolve linguistic distortion, symbolic distortion, there is a lack of attention of Habermas, if you want, at this deep level of affective life. It doesn't mean that there is no interest for emotional life, affective life, and so on, but there is this lack of focus on this important area, which is the unconscious deep dimension of the human being. And this idea, that was the basic idea of Freud, that mostly our psychic life is unconscious.
Thank you.
Some questions. We have time. We have.
Richard has a question. Richard has a question.
Richard has a question in the chat.
If you still have time, I don't know.
Yeah, we have.
Okay. My question is kind of related to the question Fatima just asked, and it may address to both to Vinicio and Paula. And it concerns, at first, the kind of interpretation of psychoanalysis presupposed in Habermas' approach of self-reflection and the idea of emancipatory knowledge. I wonder what the cost of this kind of interpretation, because from a certain point of view, it seems to require a considerable distortion of psychoanalysis means. Because yeah, for Habermas, there is causality only in neurotic compulsion. So it seems not only it seems to me that not only he talks about kind of Freud's self-misunderstanding of psychoanalysis, empirical analytical science, instead of self-reflection discipline. But it seems that mental pathology is also a kind of self-misunderstanding. The subject thinks that he is compelled to some kind of dysfunctional behavior, but the subject is not actually compelled. It's just a kind of self-deception, of self-misunderstanding. But my point is not just that, but because I remember, and it's an old book, but a book I still enjoy very much reading by Russell Keith in the early 80s. It's kind of The Politics of Social Theory, Habermas, Freud, and the Critique of Positivism. And when he Keith argues against Habermas' interpretation, not only of psychoanalysis, but also of critical social science. Keats is a philosopher of economics. He used to be a member of that radical philosophy group and a regular contributor to their journal. And part of that movement, the British realist philosophy of science of the 70s and the 80s, anti-positivistic view of philosophy of science. Anyway, but the idea that he seems to be the main point of Keats' critique is that Habermas seems to think that emancipation requires freedom from causality, and his point is not only that this entails a kind of considerable misrepresentation of psychoanalysis, an intellectualistic view of psychoanalysis, an anti-naturalistic view of psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis in any case. But also, it seems to me, this is going to be the point, psychoanalysis is just a means to an end. I think for him, this view jeopardizes the very possibility of social critical social theory being a science in any sense of the word, not only in the sense that of course it's not empirical analytical science, but in any possible meaning of the word science. And so so this misrepresentation of psychoanalysis is just a case study for a broader question, that is the meaning of critical social theory. Because I remember the previous book by this philosopher was a critical critical theory of science. This is the main issue. So this is the point I would like you to comment on. Not only this misrepresentation of psychoanalysis that seems to be implied in Habermas' approach, but the idea that it makes difficult to think of critical theory as a science in any. I'll say it seems to be this view of emancipation seems to require that we give up regarding critical theory of science. That's the point. Thank you so much for both of your speeches, by the way.
Thank you. Perhaps, Paula, you can start.
Okay. Thank you, Richard, for your question. I will try to respond point by point, but in a briefly way because of the time. Anyway, when you said about interpretation presupposes self-reflection, about this, I would say that for Habermas, psychoanalytic interpretation is a model of communicative self-reflection. Understanding one's unconscious blockades requires articulating them in language, making them objects of reflective thought. When you ask about the cost of this interpretation, I would say that Habermas reframes psychoanalysis within the horizon of rational communicative reflection. This can be seen as a limitation. I don't see, but it could be seen as a limitation, because the affective, irrational, or pre-linguistic dimensions emphasized in classical psychoanalysis are mediated through language. In other words, I would say that he does not erase the unconscious or the drives, but he translates them into a form accessible to discourse. There is some critiques, like Allen does, when she agrees that this kind of interpretation might domesticate the radical critical potential of psychoanalysis. There is this part of neurotic compulsions, empirical analytical sciences that you was talking about, and these mental pathologies as self-misunderstanding, if I understood well. Habermas extends the idea of self-misunderstanding beyond the unconscious, like neurotic compulsions, distorted knowledge, and even certain pathologies are seen as obstacles to accurate self-reflection. Just as the unconscious distorts communication with oneself, technical or empirical sciences, if poorly instrumental, risk producing knowledge that overlooks the reflexive and normative dimensions of understanding, I would say. And this critique of positivism that Habermas does by emphasizing the knowledge is interest-guided. Habermas critiques positivism for treating knowledge as neutral and poorly instrumental, psychoanalysis illustrates that even our scientific understanding is shaped by self-misunderstanding, and emancipation requires reflective, communicative reconstruction rather than mere empirical control. So I would say briefly that Habermas sees psychoanalytic interpretation as a form of self-reflection, and the cost is that, if there is that it frames, one could say that it frames unconscious conflicts and compulsions in language, so the affective and the rational dimensions are mediated, like Ellen does. Yeah, I would say this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, and above all for your reflection, because beyond the questioning there is a huge, Richard, there is a huge reflection that needs in itself to consecrate another conference on it, because this point, in which way we can reinterpret psychoanalysis in terms of hermeneutics, in which way we can create this kind of dialectics, is a very, very important, something of a tremendous importance and consequences for the future of psychoanalysis, if you want, and even for a critical approach on hermeneutics, because I see there are, as I said before, and I'm considering in all my work a series of problems we can find, and actually this model of reinterpreting the hermeneutical key psychoanalysis was largely used, as you know, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, making directly or indirectly reference to Habermas. There is a problem. There are even many differences. For example, in the case of this discussion of today, I was starting this kind of comparison between Ricoeur and Habermas, if you want. And at that level, you find a different way on approaching this point. Because if in Habermas, through this idea that the language, distorted communication is the starting point, the key point for human emancipation, and then in the therapeutic relation, the analyst must work starting from this level. Ricoeur, who promotes a kind of hermeneutical model, says that the focus is the inner life of the patient. He is still using the hermeneutical approach, but he recognizes that there are different registers of discourse in Freud. He says, in fact, on the one hand, the analyst is fighting against resistance, that is the transfer, is fighting against forces. And on the other hand, there is this hermeneutical movement, which is the movement of in the sense that the analyst is trying to help the patient to understand what he's saying until he's able to actually properly comprehend in a full sense what's happened to his or her whole life. So if you want, those two different models has the two different movements. Habermas, from the level of language, wants to provoke the language and communication a kind of change at the level of psychic life. And Ricoeur, who is promoting us another hermeneutical model, has this attention focusing the inner life. And this distinction is full of consequences, in my view, above all at theoretical level, because that's justified, for example, why Ricoeur gives much more place on the discussion concerning affectivity, the body, the deepest level of unconscious life, and so on. That is first. Second point is the fact that, anyway, if we try to rebalance the understanding of Habermas, respecting what was the logic of the Habermasian discourse, not what is the logic of the uses of Habermas in hermeneutical or psychoanalytical research, we have to say this. First, Habermas doesn't create a model for psychoanalysis. He works using psychoanalysis as an example of an emancipatory self-reflective knowledge. That means that there is no interest in Habermas to offer a new model for psychoanalysts. It's up to us, I mean, those who are interested in psychoanalysis, to see in which way we can reconsider those discourses and so on. Second point is the fact that this idea of distortion in communication and the fact that Habermas is focusing the distortion at the level of communication underlines the fact that the idea of causality in Habermas has to do with this kind of level of discourse, which is traumatisms or experiences that provokes a kind of reaction in terms of inner life towards which the patient is not able to be free, not able to counter motivation, for example. So it's not the causality as may happen, for example, in mental pathology, because he can recognize, these models can recognize that mental pathology can be separated from traumatic experiences, can be something different, can be involved the body. And again, we find it recur disinterest for the functioning of the mind, the relationship between brain and mind. Conversely, in Habermas, this major focus only on the personal experience of life. There is another aspect that probably can be of certain interest if we want developing this reasoning, that actually the more mature Habermas sounds like being more interested in cognitive psychology instead of psychoanalysis, because of this, how to say, this capability to understand the human, the emotion, the affectivity, without this effort to go in the deeper level. That means that at a certain point, Habermas has the tendency to abandon Freud's psychoanalysis, to abandon his own interest for psychoanalysis. Anyway, just to underline my point, I would say this: the interest on emancipation and the fact that Habermas' approach can be used beyond the philosophical discourse in psychoanalysis, in my view, sounds like an invitation to reconsider the theme concerning the presence of the analyst. Because if we are saying that the capacity, the interest for emancipation is a key concept, is a key element for provoking an effective therapeutic or advancement in the therapeutic relationship, we are just saying that the quality of the presence of the analyst has a key role to play. And this is a theme that we can find in psychoanalysis without doubt.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your answer.
Well, I think we coming to an end of our time. I wanna say thank you for this beautiful moments, for the beautiful morning, and for me it was a pleasure to be here with you all, with long-time friends. And well, I think this moment has come to an end, but after lunch in the afternoon, 2 p.m., we came back here with Andrea Caroni and Gavin, and thank you all.
Desculpa, Vitor, é porque tá picotando muito e aí a gente está te ouvindo muito, muito, muito mal. Eu acho que você está atualizando sobre a programação da tarde, é isso?
Yes, isso,
Sim, ele tá
exatamente.
Ah, já até melhorou um
Tentando.
pouco. Talvez chegue um pouco mais próximo, acho que a gente vai conseguir até te ouvir melhor. Pode prosseguir.
E agora, como está?
Perfeito, melhorou. Pode seguir.
Melhorou? Pode ser que não seja a internet picotando, N, pode ser o meu inglês, né?
Não,
Então,
eu acho que, na verdade, eu acho que era
oh,
a
I wanna...
distância, porque já melhorou bastante o que você está dizendo agora.
Ah, entendi. Thank you all. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Vinicio, for this beautiful morning. And at 2 p.m., we came back with André Caroni and Ana Gebring. And I want to say thank you for you all. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Paula, for this opportunity to be here with you. I miss you all.
Perfeito, obrigado, Vitor. Eu queria então agradecer muito a Paula, porque organizou a mesa. Então, muito obrigado, Paula, parabéns pela apresentação. Thank you so much, Vinicio, também pela presença, pela participação. Agradecer ao Vitor, que mediou os trabalhos. Só retomando em português, as atividades do congresso, então, voltam agora nessa tarde, a partir das 14 horas. Nós vamos ter a mesa, deixa eu pegar aqui com precisão. A mesa Trauma, Tradução e Linguagem, com André Caroni e Ana Gebrim, das 14 às 15. E, na sequência, mesa 4, com Erma Westerlink e com o Leonardo Niro, da Universidade de Essex, Trauma e os Limites da Psicanálise, lendo o Além do Princípio do Prazer. Então, essa é a programação da tarde de hoje, quer dizer, mais duas mesas, e todos estão convidados a se juntar a nós. Pergunto a Fátima ou alguém da organização se tem algum outro informe importante a ressaltar.
Não, acho que não. Isso
Perfeito.
mesmo. Obrigada, thank you, Vinícius. Obrigada, Paula. Até à tarde.
Bye, bye.